Winter arrived early in Finland in 1939. Snow-covered forests, lakes froze solid, and daylight grew short. In small towns and villages, people prepared for another long winter the way they always had, quietly, routinely, without drama. At the time, Finland was a young country, independent for barely 2 decades, small, poor, and painfully aware of its geography. To the east lay the Soviet Union, a nation that had just survived revolution, famine, purges, and fear, and now stood anxious about its borders. In Helsinki, newspapers still printed, trams still ran, people still went to work, but beneath the calm, something felt wrong. Negotiations had failed, and everyone knew what usually followed failed negotiations with Moscow. On the morning of November 30th, 1939, the silence broke. Soviet artillery opened fire, bombs fell on Helsinki, and the Winter War began. To understand the Winter War, you have to understand fear, not Finnish fear, Soviet fear. Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, sat just 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. To Joseph Stalin, that distance was unacceptable. Europe was sliding toward war. Germany was expanding aggressively. And Stalin believed, correctly or not, that Finland could one day serve as a corridor for invasion. So, the Soviet Union made demands. They wanted Finnish territory along the Karelian Isthmus, control of strategic islands, a naval base. In return, they offered land elsewhere, land that was frozen, remote, and meaningless to Finland. For Finland, these demands weren't negotiations. They were ultimatums. Accept them, and Finland's defenses would collapse. Reject them, and war would come. Finland tried to stall, to compromise, to explain. But Stalin had already decided. On November 26th, the Soviets staged an incident, shelling their own village and blaming Finland. 4 days later, the Red Army crossed the border. The Soviet Union invaded with overwhelming force, nearly 500,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft. The plan was simple: crush Finland quickly. Soviet leadership believed Finland would fall in 2 weeks. They were wrong. Finnish forces numbered barely 180,000. Many had outdated rifles. Some units lacked proper winter clothing. But they had something else. They had preparation, and they had the terrain. The forests were dense, roads were narrow, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Soviet tanks stalled, vehicles froze. Soldiers unfamiliar with winter warfare suffered frostbite before they ever saw the enemy. Finnish troops, dressed in white camouflage, moved silently on skis. They didn't fight head-on. They isolated Soviet columns, cut supply lines, surrounded units piece by piece. This tactic became known as Mahti warfare, breaking large forces into smaller, helpless pockets. And it worked. The land itself became a weapon. But survival demanded more than strategy. Men slept in snow shelters. Fingers froze. Hunger was constant. Exhaustion was relentless. And still, they held. One man came to symbolize this resistance: Simo Häyhä. A farmer by trade, quiet, almost invisible. He used iron sights instead of a scope, packed snow into his mouth to hide his breath, and waited. Sometimes for hours, without moving. By the end of the war, he had over 500 confirmed kills. But the number was never the point. He represented discipline, stillness, precision. He survived the war badly wounded and lived into old age. Most did not. For every legend, there were thousands whose names were never recorded. Young conscripts, fathers, men who froze standing guard. This was not heroic warfare. It was endurance pushed to its limit. By January 1940, the war began to shift. The Soviet Union had suffered enormous losses, but it adapted. Commanders were replaced, tactics changed, firepower increased. The Red Army stopped advancing recklessly. Instead, it advanced deliberately. Artillery hammered Finnish positions without pause. Forests were shredded. Snow turned gray with ash and blood. The Mannerheim Line became Finland's final stand. Supplies ran low. Ammunition was rationed. Food was scarce. Men were rotated out only when they collapsed. And still, they fought. But the truth became unavoidable. Finland was winning battles, but losing the war. No decisive foreign aid would come. Britain and France debated intervention, but debate does not stop artillery. By February, Soviet forces broke through. Continuing the fight would no longer be resistance. It would be destruction. On March 13, 1940, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. The guns fell silent, but peace came with loss. Finland surrendered roughly 11% of its territory. Entire regions were abandoned. Over 400,000 civilians, nearly 1/8 of the population, were displaced. Families burned their homes before leaving so the enemy would not take them. Cemeteries were left behind. Lives were uprooted overnight. The Soviet Union declared victory. But victory came at a staggering cost. Over 100,000 Soviet soldiers were dead, possibly far more. The Red Army's weaknesses were exposed to the world. Most importantly, they were exposed to Nazi Germany. Hitler studied the Winter War closely. He concluded the Soviet Union was weak. That assumption would shape the next phase of the war in Europe. Finland survived, but nothing returned to what it had been. The Winter War was not a story of triumph. It was a story of survival. A reminder that strength is not always measured in size. That preparation matters. That arrogance can bleed. And that sometimes the greatest resistance is simply refusing to disappear. Finland endured the winter, and the world remembered.